Welcome to ThinkCast. I'm Kasey Panetta. On today's episode, Daryl Plummer returns to the podcast, Distinguished Analyst and Gartner Fellow, to talk about the Gartner top strategic predictions for 2022 and beyond. We'll talk about some of the predictions, including Daryl's favorite, and the most controversial, as well as NFTs, cyberattacks, and how consumers are actively fighting data collection. Hi, Daryl. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm always glad to join you.
So I'm really excited. I love these predictions every year and finding out what you guys are kind of cooking up behind the scenes. So there's 10 predictions for the year. Before we get into the individual predictions, can you just talk about how you come up with these and how you narrow it down to just 10?
Well, the Gartner Top Predicts process, as opposed to the Gartner Mainstream Predictions process, is a specialized process where we solicit predictions from analysts all over the company, and they can submit new predictions or they can submit ones they've published throughout the past year. And we then have a board of review, essentially, which is our senior content leadership board, goes through and reviews these and they vote on them. So we go down from like 100 predictions in the first round of submissions down to about 30. And then there's a team of 7 of us, which is the top predictions team, which actually helps to narrow that down to the final 10. It's a process that starts in June, and we wind up getting the final list sometime in the middle of September, even though the presentation is due in August. So it's always a bit of a slog through this thing to get it done.
We're going to get into the individual ones in a few minutes, but they are very broad as far as topics that they cover. Are there any restrictions on topics, or can they kind of be about anything?
There are no restrictions on topics. This is not 10 technology predictions. This is top 10 predictions. And we try to strive for Wall Street Journal worthy headlines, something that the average person who reads the Wall Street Journal could read and say, I get that, what that means. It might mean something to me. It might not, but I understand it at least. When we do that, we can go almost anywhere with it. Now, of course, our insights are related to technology use and technology. So it's going to always have a technological slant to it, but there's no limit on what we could talk about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that they also touch on sort of societal issues as well. So they do all roll up into 3 major themes. So can you talk about those?
Well, the 3 things essentially are, and I'll paraphrase these here. One is about human centricity, that human beings' behavior and their identity and data are linked together because they want to have more control and sovereignty over their personal data and information. That stuff gets out of control very quickly. The second one is that we want to be more resilient and effective in our use of technology. And the third is that we have to reach beyond our expectations, reach beyond the normal way you think of things and the normal value propositions that you have to sort of find new value propositions and opportunity as it grows. So throughout it all, it's about risk and opportunity. But one set of risk is about people. The second set is about, the way people or businesses do things. And the third set is about how we think about moving forward.
So I want to jump into talking about some of these specifically. And if our listeners want to read the full list, there's a great article that Daryl helped us with that is available in the show notes. You can just click through there. But the first one, which I think is so interesting, and it's by 2024, 40% of consumers will trick behavior tracking metrics to intentionally devalue personal data collected about them, making it more difficult to monetize. So from a consumer perspective, this is super interesting. It's interesting that this is such a universally done thing. Like consumers are just tired of being tracked. And can we talk a little bit about this trend?
Well, certainly. It's interesting you said consumers are tired of being tracked, and everybody sort of is tired of it, but nobody wants to get rid of their mobile phone, which is the number one way in which you get tracked. But it really is the issue of not just being tracked. It's what gets done with that data, right? Who has it? We don't know who has it, and we don't know what they do with it. But one thing we do know is they make money from it, and we don't. And that's the thing that really frustrates people is I got to give up my personal information, put myself at risk, and I don't get to monetize it. I don't get the value back from it, not the direct monetary value at least. So people are starting to say, no, enough. I won't do that anymore. I'm going to just, make it so that my information is hard for you to use and monetize, not stop you from tracking me, because it's unlikely that we will unless we do get rid of those phones, but at least make it harder for you to make money off of me. And that then makes me feel like I'm more in control. So I think that's what people are doing for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, and you obviously explained it really well, like the intentional misdirection is really interesting. But what does that actually play out as?
Well, the simple one that I think I mentioned in the presentation, which was, having a second or third email address, and you use it when you don't want to get spam coming back at you from a website that you've bought something from. or maybe it's even having a credit card that you use, has a low limit so that if anyone misuses it, they can't misuse it for very much money. That's a simple way of thinking about this. But then it goes on to the issues, like using, a facial camouflage to trick facial recognition algorithms, right? It's basically you're starting to, to fool the systems into thinking that they're getting good data, but they're getting bad data. This is not really a new thing. People have done things from disguising your voice to using, a phone where you don't have your phone number shown, right? And these are things that are just getting more sophisticated ways in which we can actually trick the systems. And so people will tend to do it.
We're going to take a quick break to talk briefly about the Gartner Top Strategic Technology Trends for 2022. From generative AI to cybersecurity mesh, these technology trends need to be on your radar for strategic planning. Learn more and download the ebook at the link in the show notes. So the next one is very interesting as well. I think they're all interesting. I'll probably say that comment about all of them. But by 2027, a quarter of Fortune 20 companies will be supplanted by companies that neuromine and influence subconscious behavior at scale. This one feels a little nefarious, sort of at the top. So can we talk first about what is neuromining? I'm not sure if that's a term people are familiar with, and then kind of what this means at scale.
Well, neuromining is a concept, if you think about it in very simplistic terms, is exactly what the word says. It's mining the mind, the brain, and understanding how you do things, your motivations, what, nudges you in a given direction. And this is something that has been going on for a while. And most of these things, human beings have experienced this stuff before. It's just that the technology is getting to where you can now do it at scale, which means you can do it for everybody all the time. And you can look at a crowd of 1,000 people and figure out the behavior of one person standing in that crowd. This is what technology has allowed us to be able to do by detecting the cues of what people do. That comes from your language, your tone of voice, your facial expression, your behavior patterns, who you tend to talk to, what you tend to say. All of those things are ways of mining your neural state, as it were. If you go back, I said it's not new. If you've ever ridden in an elevator up an old building and you get music played, they play that music for a reason. It's not because somebody thought this is the best music ever. It's to keep you in a certain state of comfort. Same thing happens with a lot of different areas. We've had subliminal messaging going on forever, where they put little images in things and you're not supposed to see the image, but it makes you feel a certain way. We have pheromones that are released in the rooms to make you feel a certain way. All of this is about, nudging you to behave in a certain direction. And neuromining is now just a way of doing that with technology at scale across lots of people at the same time.
So it's basically a combination of increasing sophistication in technology as well as being able to now use that at scale.
Sure. Yeah. And it's increasing sophistication, it's scale, and it's still being able to pick out individuals from the crowd in that way. So that's not a bad thing overall, unless they use it in a bad way.
So the next one will probably be a little bit more, I would say, more familiar to people, maybe. By 2024, 30% of corporate teams will be without a boss due to the agile and hybrid nature of work. So I know in the research, it talks a little bit about how our move to, mostly remote, mostly hybrid, that big push kind of highlighted that a lot of managers weren't really equipped to manage in that way. So can you talk a little bit about what this looks like? I think it's hard maybe for people to imagine how corporate hierarchies could exist without a boss, but how does this work?
Well, first you have to think of what a boss is versus what a manager is, because they're not exactly the same thing. A boss is someone whose job it is, whose role it is to give you orders, to tell you what to do, generally on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. A manager may or may not do that. A manager may be responsible for the structure of the team financially, organizationally, for the guidance of the team members. But a boss, is someone who's more tactically focused on the tasks at hand. And when we look at the fact that people are becoming much more self-directed, more autonomous, and especially with remote work, sort of driving us in that direction, we find we need less and less of individuals or teams that are getting that tactical day-to-day set of instructions. So managers now can actually focus more on the part of management that's always been the most valuable, which is guidance of overall goals, right? Not the day-to-day tasks, not how you do what you're going to do today, but the fact that it needs to be done and how it fits into the bigger picture of the company. So they can become career guidance coaches. They can become success coaches. They can become, engines of growth for our employees and our teams, not just engines of instruction. And that's really a big difference that we're seeing today.
So the next one's a little frightening. I think by 2024, a cyber attack will so damage critical infrastructure that a member of the G20 will reciprocate with a declared physical attack. That is obviously a very serious one. Can you talk a little bit about where this came from and the implications?
Oh yeah, this is an interesting one in that cyber attacks. We all think about it. We watch movies about it, and it's all kind of an interesting thing in our heads. But most people, when you think about cyber attacks, they think about someone breaking in and stealing information. That's great. The movies do it. If you watch the Bond movies, they love that kind of thing, right? But I'm more likely in watching the Fast and Furious movies, where the criminals always do something that blows up a building or steals cars or an airplane or something like that. And therein lies the difference. It's not just with data we're talking about. We're talking about this movement on critical infrastructure to stop the trains from running, to stop the water from flowing, to stop the electricity from being generated. These things, or for that matter, to stop a pipeline from sending oil. When those things happen, two special conditions come into play. One, it's affecting a large number of people in a physical way that disrupts a whole chain of activities that we have going on. And two, it's an attack on the government. This is the thing. When you start looking at that, this kind of attack that's that widespread on a government, infrastructure and the like that affects all of its people is no longer just a crime, like stealing a document on a computer. It's terrorism. And as governments see it as terrorism, the response to terrorism is often a physical attack, not just a cyber attack. So we see this as a big deal because the scope of the attacks is getting broader. The frequency of the attack are getting much faster. The impact of the attack are getting bigger, and now it's terrorism, not just a crime. So when you get to that position, and we do believe this has already happened. We do believe likely there are countries that have attacked physically because of a cyber attack, but they didn't declare it as such. And it wasn't one of the biggest countries in the world. Now we're going to see that happen, is what we're saying, because of this growing in scope and impact.
I want to pause quickly to invite our listeners to learn how to create an action plan to master business composability. The 2022 CIO Agenda analyzes data from more than 2,300 CIOs and technology executives to figure out how organizations developed high business composability and pushed ahead of their peers, while creating an organization designed to deal with today's volatility. Download the ebook in the show notes. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk. I know earlier I mentioned that these are often social level things, as you can tell by the ones that we've talked about already. But I want to talk about one of the more positive ones, and that's by 2027, low orbit satellites will extend internet coverage to an additional billion of the world's poorest people, raising 50% of them out of poverty. And obviously, access to the internet for more people will fundamentally reshape, what the internet looks like. But it also is going to change lives completely.
Oh, absolutely. Think about how much your life has changed since you started using the internet regularly. Even though you don't use the internet, mostly you use the World Wide Web, two different things. The internet was invented in the 1960s and the World Wide Web was introduced in 1991. But the World Wide Web changed people's lives in major ways. It changed the entire world of business, obviously. And when we start thinking about this, it opens the door to opportunity. It democratizes the ability for people to make money, because now you don't have to be a big business to reach the entire world. And that ability, brings in investment, it brings in infrastructure, it brings in, community, and it scales it across the globe. So when you start thinking about it, getting access to the internet or to the World Wide Web, either one, allows people to actually do things that are more advantageous to their monetary situation. Or even if it's not advantageous directly monetarily, it increases the ability to participate in things that can build monetary success around you. So that's where we get into the part about raising people out of poverty. Now, what we're saying here is that, when you get to space-based internet, you see, Project Kuiper, you see Starlink, space-based internet bridges the gap between the problems that 5G creates, right? 5G creates islands of communication that can be overcome with, space-based internet, connecting everyone. So when you add that technology, the benefit of space, it's getting cheap, right? It costs less than $300,000 US to put a CubeSat up in the orbit. You could lose that in an IT budget, right? So, and low Earth orbit is getting very crowded with all these satellites. So put them to work, have them all connected together and connecting people. And then the effect can begin to take place of the value of that global marketplace called the internet or the World Wide Web.
One thing that I thought was really interesting about the sort of low orbit satellites that I guess I didn't realize is I never thought about how difficult it would be to establish like a cell base in a rural area, and how the low orbit satellites can actually respond a lot better to like demand, because they're, as you said, financially it's a little bit better, but also just like logistically.
Well, yeah, it's satellites fly over the entire planet. They can look down on any point on the planet, depending on the orbit that they're in and the time in which they're orbiting. And, that kind of think about that, to do the same thing with terrestrial technology, right? Cell towers and the like, it's just not possible. Anything's possible, but it's very expensive. And as I said, low Earth orbit satellites are getting pretty cheap to put up there and operate. So it solves a problem that had to be solved sooner or later. And it's not like anyone expected this would never be solved. It was just a matter of when. And once we get there, then we can start talking about 6G, which hasn't really officially been defined. 5G is not enough because it's missing a G, I think, or something like that. But now, let's call the G the globe. And all of a sudden, we get to a new level of capability.
So I want to talk briefly. There's one prediction about NFTs. And when we had Brian Burke on talking about the hype cycle, we were also talking about NFTs. So I want to kind of get into that briefly. And this one is by 2026, non-fungible token gamification will propel an enterprise into the top 10 highest valued companies. And I think the interesting thing about NFTs is that I think people have trouble understanding like exactly what they are, but more than that, like how do they bring business value?
Yeah. That's kind of like asking how can gold bring business value, or how can physical money bring business value, or virtual cryptocurrencies. When something is money and it can be exchanged, or it can be exchanged for money or some kind of currency, it can bring business value. When you can generate a lot of it, it can bring more business value. So that question is kind of it's kind of a misleading question of how can it bring business value. And if you've got a lot of gold, you know how you can bring business value. The problem is that people don't understand how you can turn these digital assets into gold, right? Or why anyone would even do that, right? That's where it really comes into the confusion for most people, right? And the idea of NFTs has to be explained that way to get past it. So if you start thinking about this, what makes something valuable in the world? What makes it valuable is, one, its rarity, right? How much of there is it, and it's how easy it is to get. And two, the interest in it. Okay, if people are interested in it because of its uses or because of its intrinsic value, then and its rarity, combine those two together, and you get things of great value. That cost a lot of money. In the digital world, digital assets generally don't have those two parts of the equation associated with them, right? And because you can copy a digital asset infinite number of times. So the rarity is not there. And also, the idea of if someone copies a photo that you posted online, is it your photo or their photo? How do you protect against someone taking your photo and selling it? So that's rights. A physical thing, you have possession of it. So they can't just sell it without stealing it from you and then selling it. So online, it's a lot easier to do that. So what happens with NFTs is that you're able to create an identifier to identify something that's digital uniquely as belonging to an individual or a group or some entity. Okay, it's stored in a hyperledger or a ledger style database that tracks who owns it, and nobody can copy it and get any value from it. That's essentially what tokenizing these things means. And then you have a marketplace like Ethereum where you can trade them and you can market them to other people. So if you're an artist, you tokenize a picture of your art or a digital representation of your art, and now it's valuable because it's rare. Nobody can have a duplicate of it. And because, you build interest around it because you're a certain famous artist, right? Remember Cabbage Patch Kids? Do you remember? You may be too young for that. I'm
No,
sorry.
yeah.
I don't want to be ageist in either direction. But Pet Rocks and Cabbage Patch Kids were interesting because they were rare. There were only a limited number of. Well, Pet Rocks weren't rare, but these things are often rare, and because there was a big interest around them, a cultural phenomenon. If you create a cultural phenomenon around art or around these non-fungible, non-exchangeable icons, like a smiley face. You remember the shirt? Have a nice day with the smiley face on it, right? It made millions, because it was a unique idea that could be patented. Now, if you can do that essentially with digital assets, you get the same thing. That's what we're talking about here. The last piece of that confuses people is the gamification piece, which is how you monetize this stuff, how you make it that more valuable. Gamification is the ability to make you compete against other people, to get ranking, to level up. Okay, to make sure that you feel like you're doing well in an environment. The more you feel like you're doing well, the more you'll tend to come back. And other people will want to know you because you're doing well. If you get famous enough for doing well, then your character becomes worth money. And you can then sell that character because other people want to own the character that the famous Daryl Plummer, who was really good at something, built. Now, if a company can identify an asset that's digital, it's theirs, that they've built a phenomenon around, that they've shown they're good at it, interested other people, Now they can sell it. And that's how you make money. That's how your business is going to monetize this stuff.
Well, I don't know about the listeners, but you made it make sense to me. So I appreciate that explanation. So I want to ask, we've talked about 6 of the 10, I think. Do you have a favorite one? Do you have one that you could just talk about all day?
Oh, I can talk about all of them all day because I generally have to. But the NFT one is actually my favorite because, when you ask for a favorite, we don't put these in there because we hate them. We like all of them. But I think the NFT one is my favorite. But I think the one that we haven't talked about right now that I really think is interesting is the idea of synthetic data. Synthetic data, being data made up by artificial intelligence. Artificial data made up by artificial intelligence, and they can be used to predict, things that we would never tend to try to predict. I always say the silly ones I say is that I have a degree in architectural engineering technology, and I haven't used it since I graduated. But the idea of modeling the behavior of a skyscraper in a small earthquake tremor is something we would do. The idea of modeling the behavior of that skyscraper when there are gusts of wind that go by is something we would do. But we would never think to model the behavior of the skyscraper during a small earthquake tremor and during the gust of winds at the same time, and while every person in the building flushes the toilet at the exact same moment. That's an absurd thing to model, but in synthetic data, we can use it to model it because AI can model stuff very fast, very complex scenarios, and we can do what if all day long, right? So that one's an interesting way to me.
And synthetic data has, as I understand it, like fairly big implications for security as well, because you're not using people's data. It's kind of made up data.
Yeah, made up is a sort of a strange way to say it, but it's and that's what we chose to do. But yes, it protects your privacy because it doesn't have to look at your specific data or identify it as your data. It looks at large groups of people's data and finds the patterns within them. And different people behaving different ways are related to one another through those groups. So like if you got a camera for a self-driving car looking at the highway, it doesn't have to identify every tree and every leaf on every tree. And it has to understand what trees are all about, the general shape, the general number of them in the region, and what that might do to affect the car. So it's data that's a mock-up of what's real, but not exactly every detail of what's real.
So when you were narrowing down this list to 10, was there one that was a particularly controversial? I mean, they're all really interesting. They all kind of have different commentary on parts of society and technology. But was there anyone that stuck out as really controversial?
Well, controversial has different levels to it. We had 3 of them that had some controversy. And one we talked about, the cyber warfare to Connecticut strike thing, which was, it's controversial in that it's kind of scary. We don't like to do doom and gloom predictions, right? We don't usually like to say, if you don't do this, you will fail. Right. And of course, going to a real war is a big fail. So that was controversial in that regard, but it was important. A second one that was controversial was in that it kind of felt like Gartner was pushing something on the world. This composability one about business redesign using modular, processes and composability driving business success. That's controversial because some customers, they just don't use the word composability to talk about agility and adaptability and change, management and all of these things. But it's really important that they center their thinking on the fact that they are composing success as they go. And it was controversial in that regard. And the third one that was controversial was the one about Africa talent, and that's because, we compared it to Asia talent, and sourcing from Africa versus sourcing from Asia. There are a lot of moving parts to making that work well, and it could really go off the rails quickly. So it was controversial in that regard. So there are a lot of controversies running around.
One question I always like to ask is, what should CIOs, IT executives, and I mean, these are, I think, expansive enough that they obviously roll out into all executives, but what should they be doing with this information? Is it just something to have on their radar? Is there something they should start thinking about? Like, what is the to-do for them?
Well, I think that we try to thread a story through this thing, and CIOs really need to start thinking in more humanistic terms, let me say, with more human centricity. That's a better phrase to use. They need to start thinking about, with empathy, about how this stuff all affects people, customers, employees, consumers. Everybody's got to, you got to start thinking that way. If you think about the remote work situation without a boss, that's about people. It's about making people happy so that you can retain them. They work in a more satisfying environment. It's not just about getting rid of the boss. And if you start thinking about, things like using synthetic data, it's about people, not collecting their private data and information. All of them have that thread through them that CIOs should not ignore. And it's hard because CIOs are usually thinking about the technology and its impact. Now let's just start talking about the people and their impact and how technology changes that. The second thing that CIOs have to do is start saying, look, this is all about risk and opportunity. Risk and opportunity have to be balanced here. There are new things that are happening. Those are the reach beyond moments, right? That we need to really start extending ourselves and stop, being afraid of change and embrace it and look for situations that change things farther. And then there's the idea of how do we do it efficiently and effectively so that we're still safe while we're doing it. So see, all of these predictions will touch on one of those three things: reaching beyond, being safe, through risk and opportunity, and human centricity. And those are things that CIOs will benefit from greatly if they do it right. If they do it wrong, what's going to happen is they will be increasingly displaced from the things that drive the success of their business. And that's something we would like to avoid. We want CIOs to be successful, not to be displaced.
I love this piece of research. Every year, I can't wait to read it. It's so interesting what you and your team come up with. Do you have any final thoughts to share with the audience?
Well, I always say, predictions are not there to be accurate. They're there to be compelling, to compel you to think and then to act. So we're not focused on whether they're right or wrong. We have about an 80% accuracy rate. I always tell people that every time I go back and check, it's about 80%. And I think that's too high, because if you're not wrong, you're not trying hard enough. And you have to really realize that the purpose of this thing is to compel you to think about things that you should be thinking about now and putting in your strategic plan to act on in the near-term future. And if we've done that well, but we got a percentage wrong, hey, what difference does that make? What makes a difference is whether you've been able to be successful because we opened your eyes to the right things at the right time. That's insight. And that's what I like for people to get out of it.
Thanks so much, Daryl.
And thank you.
Gartner ThinkCast is a production of Gartner. This podcast may not be reproduced or distributed in any form without Gartner's permission. It consists of the opinions of Gartner's research organization, which should not be construed as statements of fact. Content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of the speaker and/or their organization. While the information contained in this podcast has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Gartner disclaims all warranties as to the accuracy, completeness, or adequacy of such information. Although Gartner research may address legal and financial issues, Gartner does not provide legal or investment advice, and its research should not be construed or used as such. You can learn more at www.gartner.com.